At 17, they were handed a uniform, a clearance badge, and a secret the nation could never admit. The fate of entire Pacific fleets would soon depend on the speed of their minds. Behind sealed doors, these American girls would uncover movements the Japanese Navy believed were impossible to detect, and their silent calculations would alter the course of the war. The night air over Washington was windless, cold, and unusually still when the convoy of Navy trucks approached the gates of Arlington Hall. A thin frost clung to the grass, and the campus, once a quiet Southern girls' school, now pulsed with the hidden heartbeat of wartime machinery. The sentries barely spoke as the headlights swept across the brick buildings, each window sealed with blackout curtains. Inside, the hum never stopped. Even at this hour, the war pressed forward in unseen ways. The trucks stopped in near silence. The young women inside, some only 17, many fresh from rural towns and coastal high schools, stepped down onto the gravel. Their Navy-issued shoes crunched on the frost as they followed a chief petty officer toward the main entrance. The girls carried no sense of ceremony. They knew only fragments of what they had been recruited to do. Most had been told that their mathematical skills would serve the nation. None yet understood how their work would reach into the Pacific, bending the course of operations unfolding thousands of miles away. A low vibration ran through the ground as they entered the building. It was the sound of the IBM punch card machines. Endless rows of metal cabinets with spinning drums, clattering card feeders, and electrical counters that flicked digits faster than the eye could follow. Heat radiated from the machines in waves, mixing with the sharp smell of oil and ozone. The air quivered faintly, like the interior of a ship engine room. It was here, in this noise and warmth, that the quiet architecture of intelligence took shape. The chief led them through a series of narrow hallways lined with steel doors. Behind each door, the environment shifted. One room was filled with analysts bent over Japanese naval traffic logs, pages covered in pencil marks and red-lined frequency counts. Another room buzzed with the constant hiss of intercept receivers, signals captured from distant outposts in the Aleutians, Midway, and the South Pacific. The girls passed through the hallway like new recruits boarding a vessel already at full steam. By the time they reached the machine cryptanalysis wing, the night had deepened. Electric lamps cast long shadows on the floor, illuminating the pale ribbons of card stacks rising from metal bins. The room felt cavernous, alive with motion. The operators fed card decks into sorters with practiced speed, their faces lit by the warm glow of indicator lamps. Every machine clatter represented a fragment of a Japanese message, an intercepted coordinate grid, a transport convoy code group, a weather signal concealing fleet movement. For the 17-year-olds, this was their first encounter with the war's hidden front. They stood together, absorbing the intensity. A few felt the heavy sense of scale, like entering a storm whose boundaries they could not yet perceive. Somewhere out in the Pacific, American submarines hunted supply convoys, carrier groups repositioned in darkness. The Japanese Navy concealed its movements behind layers of super-enciphered traffic, confident their codes remained unbroken. Yet on these floors, the machines and their operators were working through the night, peeling back the structure of JN-25 one pattern at a time. A supervisor approached from the far end of the room, his uniform crisp, his expression sharp from sleepless nights. He handed out small booklets containing only essential instructions, machine operations, error procedures, security restrictions. The girls flipped through the pages, noting the strict prohibition on discussing anything outside the building. Even the train conductors, who brought them here, would never know what they did. Their families would ask, but the answers would always be vague. They had entered a field where silence weighed as heavily as skill. The supervisor motioned them toward a row of empty machine stations. Each was equipped with a card reader, sorter, and tabulator, tools that would become extensions of their hands. The first lesson began immediately. The girls learned how a single misfeed could distort an entire analytic chain, how a sorter failure could erase an hour of pattern building, how every card punched by intercept clerks miles away represented an unknown operational choice by an enemy fleet. As they practiced, the building shifted subtly around them. The radio intercept room reported a sudden rise in traffic volume. Analysts in the adjacent office moved quickly, extracting call signs and timestamps. Within minutes, a new sequence of raw groups arrived for machine testing. The girls watched as their supervisors loaded the fresh deck into the punch machines. The cards rattled sharply, sending vibrations into the floor. Somewhere far across the Pacific, a Japanese wireless operator had just transmitted coordinates that the U.S. Navy desperately needed to interpret. The youngest girls sensed, without being told, that they were standing at the edge of a deepening storm, a storm made not of thunder, but of numbers, encrypted bearings, fleet grids, convoy schedules, the hidden mathematics of war. And here, in this sealed building, 17-year-old Americans were about to become its interpreters. By the early 1940s, American naval intelligence occupied a fragile position. The Pacific was vast beyond comprehension. An oceanic battlefield measured not just in miles, but in days of radio silence, shifting squalls, and the unpredictable movements of carrier task forces. The Japanese Navy operated with deliberate ambiguity, relying on rigid discipline and encrypted coordination to maintain its reach across the Central and South Pacific. Their signals, wrapped in the superenciphered layers of JN-25, moved through the air like shadows, structured, precise, and invisible to those without the means to decode them. Long before the teenage recruits stepped into Arlington Hall, a small group of American cryptologists had begun the painstaking process of dissecting Japanese naval ciphers. The work was slow, requiring a combination of mathematical acuity, pattern recognition, and mechanical assistance. The earliest codebooks were partial at best. Analysts worked with fragments, building tentative dictionaries from isolated terms, course headings, escort identifiers, weather markers, each discovered through hours of reconstruction. The U.S. Navy needed more operators, more analysts, and more minds capable of feeding the mechanical systems that would reveal the larger structure. As the demand for codebreakers grew, the traditional pipeline was overwhelmed. The Navy's male cryptologic personnel were increasingly diverted to combat roles, shipboard communications, or field stations. The answer came from an unusual direction: American girls' schools and rural high school classrooms. Mathematics teachers noticed students who solved problems with startling speed. University counselors quietly flagged young women scoring in the highest percentiles. Recruiters sought discipline and precision, qualities the war now demanded in abundance. Across the country, envelopes marked with the insignia of the U.S. Navy arrived in small towns and coastal cities. The instructions were brief but unmistakable: report for specialized service, no prior experience required. Many of the girls accepted without fully understanding the implications. What mattered was the opportunity to contribute, to step into a role defined not by physical strength, but by intellectual pressure. For some, it was the first time anyone had acknowledged their mathematical talent as a national asset. The infrastructure that awaited them had evolved quickly. Arlington Hall, once quiet and suburban, now functioned as the epicenter of U.S. Army codebreaking, while the Navy's OP-20G operations spilled across Washington in annex buildings, temporary huts, and adapted classrooms. The entire city carried the pulse of classified work. Strict cars ferried personnel who never spoke of their assignments. Windows remained shuttered late into the night. Even the rhythm of footsteps changed. Workers moved with the purposeful calm of people who understood that mistakes here radiated far beyond the walls. The Japanese communication system itself formed a complex hierarchy. High-level fleet coordination relied on JN-25, a codebook-based system that transformed words into numerical groups before layering an additional additive cipher. Below it, auxiliary systems governed logistical movement, airfield reports, and weather traffic. The intercept network stretched across the Pacific. American outposts in the Aleutians, Hawaii, Australia, and Dutch Harbor monitored transmissions around the clock, sending raw intercepts to Washington for deeper analysis. The flow was relentless, measured in thousands of group sequences per day. The teen codebreakers would soon form the backbone of the processing chain. They operated IBM sorters, capable of analyzing patterns that humans could not track reliably at scale. They learned the geometry of punch card logic, the way perforations created pathways for electrical contact, the way card decks could be layered to reveal statistical anomalies. Their work fed into naval analysis rooms, where officers constructed battle estimates and projected enemy movements. In those early years, every fragment mattered. A repeated group that appeared insignificant could indicate a shift in convoy formation. A change in additive frequency might reveal that the Japanese Navy had updated its cipher tables. The recruits were trained to understand the consequences of even the smallest deviation. When the Pacific shifted violently, when Guadalcanal hung in balance, when carrier groups repositioned north of the Solomons, Washington felt the tension in every intercepted signal. As the girls settled into their assignments, the scope of their responsibility expanded. They worked in machine wings during the day, in analytic units during the night, and in traffic index rooms where the sheer volume of Japanese transmission logs told its own story. Some learned to recognize call signs by memory, identifying Japanese destroyer divisions, submarine tenders, or forward air groups without needing a reference chart. Others specialized in reconstructing broken codebook fragments, piecing them together like archaeologists, uncovering the skeleton of an enemy fleet. By the time OP-20G realized the full potential of its teenage workforce, the Pacific War had entered a new and volatile phase. Japanese fleet movements became more urgent. American submarines pressed aggressively into shipping lanes. Carrier groups prepared for operations that demanded precise intelligence. The weight placed upon Arlington Hall's machines grew heavier with each passing week. The girls, now acclimated to the relentless rhythm, understood, if only at a sensory level, that their work reached beyond the walls. Their punched cards, pencil marks, and statistical runs traveled across secure channels to Navy command centers. There, officers examined the patterns and made decisions that shaped the timing and direction of U.S. operations. The world that led to this moment was one of vast distances and invisible battles. A world where 17-year-old Americans would soon play a decisive role in unlocking the intentions of an enemy they would never see. A role that would place them at the heart of one of the greatest intelligence achievements of the Pacific War. The first meaningful breakthrough did not arrive with fanfare. It began as a fluctuation, small, almost unremarkable, in the pattern of intercepts entering Arlington Hall's processing chain. The raw signals carried the same rigid structure as always. Columns of 5-digit groups, steady in rhythm, uniform in spacing. Yet the analysts sensed something beneath the surface. A convoy designation seemed to repeat with unusual frequency. A weather group appeared out of cycle. The additive layers, normally chaotic, showed faint alignment that suggested a shift in Japanese naval procedures. The teen operators would not have recognized the full scope of what they were witnessing, but they felt the change in tempo. Intercept runners moved faster between rooms. In first, supervisors hovered with a deeper focus, tracking the progress of each machine cycle. Night routines blurred as new decks arrived without pause. Somewhere across the Pacific, an operation was unfolding, and Washington could feel its shadow stretching toward them. In the machine room, the air thickened with heat. The IBM sorters accelerated through card sequences, their internal brushes sparking against metal contacts in rapid succession. The girls monitored tray outputs, comparing counts, logging the rise of a specific traffic signature. A new identifier, linked to a forward Japanese fleet element, had begun transmitting with unusual persistence. Each card that emerged from the sorters carried a fragment of its activity, a direction, a formation number, a hint of operational tempo. As the decks grew in size, the processing chain took on a controlled urgency. Analysts from the adjacent wing moved closer to the machines, watching the numeric patterns emerge from the card trays. The teen operators absorbed the tension without being told its cause. Their hands moved steadily, feeding cards into machines that vibrated with a dull metallic hum. Sweat gathered at their brows, despite the cool air circulating through the vents. This was the rhythm of contact, the unseen exchange where enemy intentions first reached American hands. Within hours, the first hints of a coordinated Japanese movement became clear. Messages from multiple high-level call signs aligned in timing and structure. Their origin points traced a vector across the Central Pacific. Analysts layered the reconstructed patterns against historical traffic, identifying elements tied to carrier support groups and escort flotillas. Each clue emerged from the mechanical noise of the punch card wings, carried upward through index logs and statistical summaries. The youngest operators learned quickly that breakthroughs rarely arrived at once. They revealed themselves through accumulation, through the steady emergence of a pattern strong enough to cut through the encrypted haze. A particular numeric sequence repeated across 3 different intercept stations. A long-range weather bulletin, normally routine, appeared addressed to a fleet position inconsistent with prior deployments. A logistics code, once partial, suddenly connected to an earlier fragment, reconstructed weeks before. As the indicators strengthened, OP-20GI analysts initiated a deeper, more targeted run. This required expanded machine cycles, higher card volumes, and a continuous feed of new intercepts. The teen operators became the backbone of the escalation. Their machines sorted tens of thousands of cards through the night, extracting alignments the human eye could not reliably detect. They worked under the low glow of desk lamps, surrounded by the constant percussion of metal on metal. A faint vibration traveled through the building as the heaviest machinery activated, tabulators designed to test additive chains against known fragments of the JN-25 codebook. When the first correlation appeared, the supervising officer did not announce it, but the shift in his posture told the operators what they needed to know. They had reached the threshold of understanding. A piece of the Japanese operational plan had surfaced. The reconstructed groups pointed toward movement east of the Marianas. It was not a confirmation, but a probability, one strong enough to command attention. The analysts cross-checked the emerging picture with submarine reports and distant weather intercepts. Everything aligned with an operational pattern consistent with previous Japanese deployments before large-scale maneuvers. What the young operators did not see was the classified briefing drafted in a secure room 2 floors above them. There, senior officers traced arcs across a Pacific map, marking the probable path of a Japanese fleet element. The intelligence was still incomplete, but the signals carried weight. The timing, traffic density, and nature of the call signs suggested preparations that American commanders could not ignore. Meanwhile, in the machine rooms, the teen codebreakers continued their work with a precision born from repetition. Their hands moved through the motions unconsciously, sorting, counting, correcting misfeeds, logging output. The building seemed to breathe with them, each machine cycle pulling in air and expelling heat, as though preparing for endurance. It was during one of these late-night runs that the first confirmed indicator appeared, a repeated group long suspected to reference an operational rendezvous. When the tabulator aligned it cleanly with an intercepted weather instruction, the analyst knew the significance. A Japanese fleet had crossed a threshold. It was no longer maneuvering, it was committing. For the 17-year-old girls operating the machinery, The moment passed like any other. The machines clattered, the lights flickered, and new card stacks arrived for processing. But the analysts, watching from behind them, understood what had just emerged through the noise. The first real contact, silent, numeric, invisible, had been made. And from that moment forward, Arlington Hall shifted into a higher state of alert. The Pacific War had reached their desks. Pressure accumulated quietly in the walls of Arlington Hall as the Japanese operation intensified. The intercept volume rose in steady waves, and each hour delivered new fragments that demanded immediate processing. The once predictable rhythm of the machine rooms fractured under the demands of sustained analysis. Lights burned without interruption. The clatter of IBM sorters merged into a dense mechanical roar. Even the air took on a heavier quality, thick with heat and the metallic scent of continuous operation. In this atmosphere, the young operators, still only months removed from high school classrooms, found themselves positioned at the fulcrum of an expanding intelligence race. Their workstations grew crowded with card stacks, marked in red pencil. Supervisors moved briskly between wings, carrying fresh intercepts pulled from distant stations in the Aleutians, Bainbridge Island, and Melbourne. Each sequence carried information that, when layered correctly, could narrow the Japanese fleet's position by hundreds of miles. But the machinery now approached its limits. The sorters, never designed for uninterrupted high-volume runs, developed quirks under strain. Brushes misaligned, tabulators overheated, and the metallic rhythm faltered without warning. A single jam could cost an hour, and an hour could invalidate the timeline of the analysis chain. The girls learned to sense a malfunction before it manifested, by the faint pitch change in a motor or the subtle hesitation of a card feed. Their awareness grew instinctive, shaped by long nights spent tracing faults beneath the warm glow of inspection lamps. Fatigue settled over them, but it was a silent fatigue. No one spoke of sleeplessness or strain. The environment permitted no space for such acknowledgement. Instead, the pressure expressed itself in small physical adjustments. The tightening of shoulders, the focused narrowing of eyes, the steadier pace of breathing. For the youngest operators, the psychological weight came from understanding that any error could carry consequences far beyond their own responsibilities. A misread count, a misplaced card, or a misfiled deck could distort the picture forming at the upper levels of naval command. Within the analytic rooms, the shape of the Japanese movement sharpened. Correlations between specific call signs and logistic requests suggested an upcoming rendezvous of significant scale. Tonal shifts in weather traffic indicated preparations for long-range deployment. Support vessels, once dispersed, began appearing in close temporal proximity. The analysts mapped these emerging patterns across Pacific charts, marking arcs of probability that gradually converged into a narrow sector east of the Marianas. The sense of escalation permeated every corner of the building. Runners quickened their steps. Intercept logs arrived marked with urgent notations. Operators adjusted their machine settings with heightened precision, aware that the analytic teams were now working with minimal margins. The once steady workflow had transformed into a continuous surge, fueled by the looming threat of losing the thread of the Japanese operation. The breaking point approached late one night when the intercept flow reached its peak. A high-level Japanese call sign transmitted repeatedly, generating an unprecedented volume of traffic. The additive sequences, normally dispersed, showed unusual coherence, an indicator that the Japanese Navy was coordinating multiple fleet elements simultaneously. Analysts, sensing the significance, called for an extended mechanical run, one that required near-perfect alignment between the sorters, tabulators, and human operators. The young women took their positions. The machines activated in sequence, filling the room with a vibration that felt almost structural. Heat poured from the vents as motors accelerated to maximum load. Card decks, thousands of them, moved across the room in organized waves. Each deck represented a possible fragment of the Japanese plan. Each mistake, each hesitation, threatened to collapse the delicate scaffolding of analysis built over the previous days. As the hours passed, the stress became tangible. Shoulders ached from repetition, fingers stiffened from card handling, eyes strained against the dim glow of indicator lamps. Yet the operators continued, synchronized with the machinery around them. They fed cards with unwavering steadiness, corrected misfeeds with swift precision, and documented outputs with methodical clarity. Exhaustion etched into their posture, but the chain never broke. Then it happened. A series of clean alignments across multiple decks. The first indication emerged from a sorter tray, a repeated group, previously ambiguous, now linked to a specific logistical directive. Minutes later, the tabulator produced a correlation between two additive chains that had resisted reconstruction for weeks. Analysts converged instantly, reading the output with sharp, urgent concentration. The results were unmistakable. A major Japanese fleet element had shifted position and was preparing for a coordinated action. The numeric indicators, once scattered across days of intercepts, now formed a cohesive picture. The fleet's approximate location, its supporting vessels, and its projected movement vector had finally surfaced. For the operators in the machine wing, the moment arrived not with celebration, but with a subtle change in atmosphere. Supervisors moved with new purpose. Analysts departed quickly, carrying fresh intelligence toward secure briefing rooms. The machinery continued running, but the tension eased by degrees, just enough for the girls to feel the weight of the preceding hours settle into their muscles. They had reached the breaking point, and they had endured it. Through heat, noise, fatigue, and the relentless mathematics of war, the youngest members of the Navy's cryptologic force had delivered the insight American commanders were waiting for. The Pacific, vast and uncertain, had revealed one of its secrets, and it was 17-year-old Americans who had forced it into the light. The intelligence extracted from those long nights at Arlington Hall moved swiftly through the channels of Naval Command. Secure couriers carried the reconstructed traffic to the Office of Naval Communications, where senior officers reviewed the findings against reconnaissance gaps and submarine patrol reports. The picture that emerged, shaped by thousands of punch cards handled by teenage operators, provided clarity at a moment when uncertainty dominated the Pacific. Fleet planners adjusted their projections. Submarine commanders received updated search patterns. Carrier groups shifted course along vectors, refined by the analysis. No announcement was made to the girls in the machine rooms. They remained unaware that their work had just influenced one of the most consequential movements of the Pacific War. Yet the decisions made in high-level briefing rooms were anchored in the very alignments the young operators had revealed through sheer endurance and precision. Weeks later, as the operation unfolded far across the ocean, fragments of Japanese traffic confirmed the accuracy of the intelligence. Intercepts revealed disrupted logistics, repositioned commands, and transmissions consistent with a fleet operating under pressure. Analysts at Arlington Hall noted the changes with quiet satisfaction, not celebration, but recognition that the signals mirrored their earlier assessments. In intelligence work, confirmation seldom arrived cleanly. Instead, it surfaced in subtle variations across intercepted weather requests, altered call sign structures, or the silence that accompanied disrupted routes. The operators continued their routines with the same disciplined pace. To them, the war remained a sequence of numerical patterns, card decks, and machine cycles. They did not see the carriers' closing distance, or the submarines adjusting their patrol arcs. They did not witness the shifting formations on the ocean surface, or the exhaustion of Japanese wireless operators transmitting under duress. The entire conflict reached them only through the coded abstractions that cascaded across their desks. Yet within the restricted wings of naval intelligence, the significance of their contribution grew unmistakable. Senior cryptologists noted the accuracy of the mechanical runs, the precision of card handling, and the resilience of the operators under sustained pressure. The strain of those critical days had revealed the true capability of the teenage workforce, individuals who had arrived with limited training but who possessed an instinctive discipline that elevated the performance of OP-20G. Their legacy, however, was shaped just as much by what they could never say. The secrecy surrounding their work extended beyond the war's end. They were instructed to return home without discussing their service, without referencing JN-25, without acknowledging the machine rooms, the coded decks, or the intelligence they helped produce. Families welcomed them back unaware of the scale of their responsibilities. Friends assumed they had performed clerical duties. Communities recognized their uniforms, but not the depth of their contribution. Arlington Hall itself changed after the war. Machines were relocated. Temporary wings were dismantled. The intense atmosphere of those years dispersed as quickly as it had formed. Yet the building retained echoes of the nights when the future of Pacific operations depended on the steady hands of young women standing at metal consoles. The dust that settled on machine rails concealed the vibrations that once carried the weight of fleet movement across thousands of miles. In later decades, historians pieced together the cryptologic record. Declassified documents revealed the scope of the U.S. Navy's code-breaking apparatus, the magnitude of intercepted traffic, and the role of machine operators in reconstructing the logic of Japanese signals. Only then did the contributions of the teenage waves come into view. Their work, once hidden behind locked doors and lifelong silence, emerged as a foundational element of American cryptologic success in the Pacific. Their impact was not defined by dramatic battlefield movements or direct confrontation. It manifested instead in the quiet discipline of repetition, the feeding of cards, the verification of counts, the recognition of anomalies. These actions, performed under pressure and without recognition, shaped outcomes far beyond their sight. Every Japanese fleet movement, illuminated by American intelligence, owed something to the cumulative weight of their effort. For many of them, the war became a memory of sound and light, the heat of machines at full load, the metallic rhythm that marked the passage of each hour, the glow of indicator lamps in dim rooms. They remembered fatigue rather than fear, precision rather than triumph. Their service lacked the visible arc of conventional heroism, yet its influence extended across the vast expanse of the Pacific and into the broader history of American intelligence. In the quiet years that followed, they carried the knowledge that they had helped shift the course of a distant war, not through force, but through comprehension, not through visibility, but through secrecy, not through headlines, but through numbers. And though the world outside Arlington Hall never witnessed the decisive moment when patterns aligned and the Japanese fleet revealed itself, the legacy remained encoded in the nation's history, that at the height of the Pacific War, some of America's most critical victories began in the hands of 17-year-old girls working through the night, hidden behind sealed doors, deciphering the movements of an enemy they would never meet.